All right, good evening. My name is Hannah Antosh, and this is the Frank Starling Heart Law for Anatomy and Physiology 2 with Dr. Brittany Smith. So before we get started, what exactly is the Frank Starling Heart Law? So the Frank Starling Heart Law describes a kind of relationship between the length of the myocardial fibers and the force that is generated by contraction, by the heart's contraction. This force is generated when the length of the sarcomeres are increased and that overlap between the thick and thin filaments decreases. This helps to create a larger force of contraction. This increases the force, creating a stronger contraction. In plain terms, what do I mean by this? So what I mean is the more blood that is found within the cardiac ventricles, the more blood that is down here, the more that is stretched, the more that those ventricles are stretched, and the more that they're stretched, creates like a larger contraction that creates more force. So imagine that you have 3 balloons. Balloon A, balloon B, and balloon C. Now starting with balloon A, imagine that you only blow up balloon A a fourth of the way, right? Balloon A maybe looks like a balloon that has been left behind for a couple weeks, right? It's not full of air anymore. It's kind of only part of the way filled. So think of balloon A as filled up about a quarter of the way. Next up, we have balloon B. Now, balloon B is filled up, we'll say halfway. A little bit more than balloon A, but definitely nowhere near all the way full. Now imagine with that final balloon, balloon C, that you have balloon C filled up completely. It is full to bursting. Now, think about what would happen if you were to let all 3 balloons go. Imagine they're not tied and you just let them go. Which balloon would have the most force as it blows away? The answer would, I hope, be balloon C. Similar to how in this word picture, the air is acting like blood. Okay, so as those ventricles fill up with more blood and they expand, when the heart contracts, it's that relationship between the length of the fiber and the that contraction, right? The more that it's displaced, the stronger that contraction comes on and forces that blood, or in the balloon's case, that air outwards. Now, it's not a perfect word picture, but I hope it kind of creates an idea of what I'm talking about. So what are the benefits of the Frank Starling Heart Law? Well, there's 3 main ones I'm going to talk about today. The first one is systolic heart failure. So when a heart undergoes systolic heart failure, the Frank Starling mechanism acts like a buffer to kind of pad the heart's inability to put out adequate cardiac output. Because in systolic heart failure, the heart is no longer pumping as effectively as it was, and therefore it is no longer giving that oxygen-rich blood, or as much oxygen-rich blood as the body needs. So when that happens, right, that ventricle isn't pumping nearly as effectively as it should. And so it's leading to kind of like a pool of blood being left in here, which will eventually increase those myocardial fibers, right? It's going to be that balloon C where it's getting filled up more and more, and this is where the Frank Starling mechanism comes into play. Okay, it's going to, as those myocardial fibers are stretched and that it's filled up, it's going to create that stretch, which is going to create that big contraction of muscles, which is going to create more force. When heart failure is caused by an impaired contractile function of that left ventricle, it's going to negatively impact the ventricle performance all over the place. which will decrease that stroke volume. Like I was just saying, that decrease in stroke volume will increase the amount of leftover blood left in the heart, which stretches it, gives us a greater stroke, and gives us a larger contraction on that next beat, thanks to that Frank-Starling mechanism. Unfortunately, though, the Frank-Starling mechanism really only works for milder cases of systolic heart failure. Once cases of systolic heart failure reach a more critical level, it is no longer able to keep up, and it can lead to pulmonary congestion because the heart is no longer able to effectively clear itself as well. The second thing I'm going to talk about is dilated cardiomyopathy. As you can see here, I have a nice little bio render that I created of a heart experiencing cardiomyopathy. So similarly with the systolic heart failure, in dilated cardiomyopathy, both the right and left ventricles are going to experience, they're both going to be dilated, and they're both going to experience decreased contractility, either word is fine. They're going to both experience decreased contraction rates, right? They're not going to be able to contract as well or as effectively. And so in the same way as a systolic heart failure, that Frank-Starling mechanism is going to let these bottom ventricles here be filled up more, and then which is going to create more stretch, create more pressure, and create a bigger contraction with more force. Now, in this case, what's really cool is that the Frank-Starling mechanism works alongside of neurohormonal hormones that are going to be activated by the person's sympathetic nervous system. Okay, and those two things, the sympathetic nervous system, those neurohormonal transmitters, and the Frank-Starling mechanism are all going to work together to increase heart rate. And by increasing the heart rate, it will increase the contractility of that heart. And while this is good for heart function and keeping a person going in that moment, unfortunately what can happen is that symptoms can be covered up by this, I guess you could call it a crutch, right? Because this mechanism and the neurohormonal and everything, right, because they're all working together, it can actually cover up the symptoms of this dilated cardiomyopathy, and so the patient may not know until it has progressed, even up until it's progressed into them experiencing clinical signs and symptoms of systolic heart failure. And finally, exercise. So exercise can also stimulate the Frank-Starling mechanism. So when a person exercises, hormones called catecholamines, like norepinephrine, are released during exercise. Which, if you've seen Legally Blonde, Reese Witherspoon in it tells the jury that the accused could not have committed the crime because she exercises. Exercise gives you endorphins, and endorphins make you happy, which is true. Those endorphins also can result, those catecholamines can also result in an upward shift of the Frank-Starling mechanism. So what happens is when these are released, it's going to increase the binding to the myocyte beta L adrenal receptors. This increased binding is actually going to trigger an increased output of calcium ions from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then all of these pieces work together to increase the force of contraction with the next beat. And part of the reason this happens is because as you exercise, your muscles need extra oxygen-rich blood in order to keep up with the demand placed upon them. So your heart is working faster thanks to the Frank-Starling mechanism, as well as the hormones that are being put out during this time. And here are my references, as well as a little disclaimer that the beautiful slideshow was created by and downloaded from SlidesGo. And then all the little heart, all of these graphics here were created by me using BioRender. So anyway, thank you so much and have a great night.